Welcome back to Specimen the Sociologist. This is your host, Jessamine Reichman. Now, I tend to tell people that Jessamine rhymes with specimen, but with a J. And I am a budding sociologist on a mission to figure out the science behind our social lives. Now, today we'll be unpacking how to scientifically steward your relationships. Because, hot take, relationships are not casually formed, and they require evidence-based strategies to better steward them. You may by chance meet a person in passing, in a recreational sports league, perhaps at a birthday party, or in a classroom. However, your habits have a lot more to say about the relationships that you choose or choose not to build, and overall, their success. So in this episode, we will leverage the social exchange theory to define different types of relationships, how to scientifically build relationships, and ultimately how to be secure with those around you. With that being said, let's briefly unpack sociology. What is she and why is she relevant in 2026? Well, in simple terms, sociology is the study of how people interact in groups and how societies are organized. As an academic discipline, it looks at patterns in human behavior, such as how families, communities, institutions, cultures, and systems influence the way that people think and act. So in 5 words or less, sociologists analyze our social lives. Now, to assist in this process, our field has sociological theories which operate as frameworks to help us understand and predict how people behave, interact, and organize. Now, today, as I had mentioned earlier, we will be learning about the social exchange theory, also known as SET, which unashamedly is one of my favorites, and hopefully it will be yours too by the end of the episode. But first things first, let's get into the history of it all. Now, the genesis of social exchange theory began in 1958 when American sociologist George C. Homans published an article titled Social Behavior as Exchange. Homans combined behaviorism and basic economics to understand how relationships are formed through a process of cost-benefit analysis. Basically, this guy was unpacking the economy of our social lives. In the years following, other studies and professionals expanded the framework of Homans' fundamental concepts, and that is how the social exchange theory was developed. Now, as a person may invest money and expect returns for their stocks, relational investment can include time, energy, emotions, and the return be either love, favor, appreciation, admiration, or really anything that we as individuals value. It almost creates this social equation where the pluses and minuses of a relationship can produce data that can determine whether someone is benefiting from a relationship, putting too much in it, or maybe not receiving enough from it. Now, this theory is also unique because it doesn't rely solely on emotions to evaluate relationships. Instead, it focuses on whether a relationship feels balanced and fair. Now, while we spoke about the history of the social exchange theory, I want to unpack 3 of the core assumptions that are affiliated with this theory. Number 1 would be that people seek rewards and avoid costs. So in relationships, individuals will try to maximize benefits, such as support, love, or companionship, while minimizing negative factors such as conflict, stress, or even financial commitment. Now, as a friendly reminder, the quote-unquote reward at stake in these relationships are typical intangible concepts, such as respect, reciprocal action, and even a relationship that can fuel an emotional need. Now, before we move forward, I just want us to take a deep breath, because while this theory sounds kind of harsh and merely transactional, it doesn't mean that we have to calculate everything consciously, but it's just a useful way to understand why we might stick around in a relationship or perhaps leave another one. Now that we've learned about the history of the social exchange theory, let's look at how it can apply to our everyday conversations. Because while we may not use the verbiage cost-benefit analysis to evaluate the quality of a relationship, we may adopt it subtly in our thought processes and in our actions. And so here are 3 different types of relationships that you may find yourself subtly adopting this theory to help determine whether you remain in this relationship or how you steward them. Example number 1, friendships. Now, individuals may pursue friendships based on shared values and interests, in which they may continue to put effort into the relationship if they are supported, valued, and respected in return. On the flip side, if one person constantly gives without receiving support back, the friendship may start to feel unbalanced. For example, I can recall when I was starting to recognize some people pleasing patterns in my personal life. And as I addressed those, my relationships began to naturally shift. Because again, as a friendly reminder, people pleasing is the habit of prioritizing the comfort, approval, and the needs of others over your own. And there was one relationship in particular, because there always is going to be that one relationship in particular where I thought this friendship was mutual, but over time I realized it was more one-sided, and it was shaped by my generous nature and a tendency to feel that being helpful meant that I was being valued. And that was not the case. So as I slowly shifted from prioritizing this other person's needs and, began to express my own, this person pulled back. And then one day they sent the most Irish exits of all text messages and said, quote unquote, this relationship is no longer serving me. And I was like, I thought it, but you said it. That's actually crazy. But anyways, that is just a cheeky example of how people can use the social exchange theory to determine the value of a relationship. Again, cost-benefit analysis. Now, example number 2, romantic partnerships. If you grew up watching Disney Channel or you are an avid rom-com consumer, you may believe that love is blind, or perhaps admit that people fall in love. But I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but romantic relationships operate a little differently. And especially when it comes to the social exchange theory, it shows us that people stay satisfied romantically when the emotional rewards such as love, security, intimacy feel worth the effort, sacrifice, and labor that they put in. And so this is probably like one of those relationships where I think that's fair because your lover, your life partner, your boo thing, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your partner, this is the one relationship that you actively get to choose in life. So I think you should totally evaluate who you're dating in a healthy way, not a judgmental way, but in a way where you can ask yourself the question, do their values align with mine? And what healthy ways do they challenge me as a person? How is our communication style? Like, I think that's really good to, evaluate a relationship based off of the health of both you and them. But anyways, that's example number 2. Example number 3 is work relationships. Now, these relationships are so important because you're going to be spending early mornings and late nights, and honestly, a majority of your life with these folks. But what the social exchange theory can show us is that a worker may decide how much effort to give based on rewards such as pay, recognition, promotion, and or work-life balance. And this is probably the easiest relationship dynamic to understand as it relates closest to our concept that every social interaction can be viewed as a transaction. Now, those are just 3 cheeky examples, and the list can go on for the different type of relationships that we may find ourselves in over a lifetime. While social exchange theory explains relationships through patterns of cost, rewards, and reciprocity, I want to interject a little specimen the sociologist perspective and suggest that the long-term quality and stability of relationships often depend less on transactional exchange and more on a person's character and capacity for mutual care. Because I can't even count the number of times that I have been a beneficiary of someone's kindness, whether it was from a stranger, from a family member, from a close friend. Like, some things can't be accounted for, they can only be experienced. And so when I think of all the interactions that I have in a week, it's kind of impossible to keep a tally, right? With the pros and the cons and this and that. But I realize at the end of the day, the common denominator across all my interactions is myself. And I found that when I approach relationships from a value-based place, I become more adaptable, more present, and ultimately more capable of deepening meaningful connections with those around me, as well as knowing, which relationships, may be off balance because we move differently. So, with all that being said, let's transition into the second part of this episode, where we talk a little bit more about the science behind our social behavior. Research constantly shows that a person's character traits are some of the strongest predictors of relationship quality and stability, often even more influential than specific relationship skills like communication, listening, or financial management. For example, a large meta-analysis conducted by the National Library of Medicine of over 111 different studies found that traits such as agreeableness, emotional stability, and conscientiousness are strongly linked to higher relationship satisfaction. Similarly, another meta-analysis of over 148 studies on neuroticism and relationship qualities found a clear negative pattern, meaning that people higher in emotional instability tend to report lower relationship quality across different contexts. Finally, a 9-year study of couples found that personality traits, especially a person's own level of neuroticism and consciousness, can have a major impact on relationship satisfaction over time, sometimes even more than the partner's traits. And this suggests that the habits, attitudes, and emotional patterns we bring into a relationship play an important role in how that relationship grows and develops. Now, I'm not here just to drop random facts without proper context. Instead, I'm here to help unpack the science, again, behind your social lives. So, if we understand that our character is directly correlated to the quality of our relationships, whether that be familial or professional, it's an empowering place to be if you desire change. And this is where we get into my favorite part of the episode, making the data applicable to you, the listener. Now, you will be relieved to know that the foundation of your relationships, well, it wasn't really formed by you. Rather, it was developed by our sociological circumstances that shape the way that we relate to people long before we can consciously think about relationships. Because I would make the case that none of us enter the world emotionally or relationally neutral. We inherit habits, fears, expectations, and relational instincts from the environments that formed us. For example, family is usually the first influence. If someone grows up around stability, affection, and healthy communication, they may learn trust and openness. If they grow up around criticism, neglect, chaos, or emotional unpredictability, they may become guarded, avoidant, controlling, or people-pleasing. Now, if I can take it a step further, I would make the case that many adult relational patterns are adaptations to earlier social environments. But you can take that sentence to your therapist. Now, let's not give all the credit to our families, because we can look at how culture and community shape us as well. For example, certain cultures may value directness, while others may prioritize harmony and adopt more passive forms of communication. Some may emphasize individualism, while others may emphasize community. And you know what? Actually, speaking of community, there are different social spaces such as church, school, friend groups, and online spaces that reinforce certain relational habits, which means that over time, people absorb the emotional tone of the worlds they live in, which is why your character is so important. But again, I'll come back to that later in the episode. But for now, the last point I want to make is that trauma and social experiences matter as well. Repeated betrayal, exclusion, discrimination, or instability can train people to anticipate harm before connection. And many behaviors that may seem irrational in a relationship are actually learned survival strategies. Now, I say all this not because I believe our lives are going to play out like the Final Destination franchise, meaning that it's going to be predetermined for you. Instead, I say this to give you the gift of clarity, because as simple as it is to learn a behavioral pattern, is as simple as it is to unlearn it. Because again, if we inherit relational tendencies from our environments, we are responsible for how we steward them. For example, I myself grew up in a household of divorced parents. Now, while it wasn't my direct marriage and it wasn't my direct romantic partnership, I still have to acknowledge the fact that I probably caught some secondhand smoke, right? And maybe my communication style isn't the strongest. Or maybe I may have a little bit of anxiety as it comes to romantic partnerships and being vulnerable with whoever I'm dating. So again, it doesn't make me the villain, but it does make me responsible for identifying my default behavioral patterns. Now, with all that to say, this is the best part of the podcast. I'm not just here to give you history. I'm not just here to talk about theory. I'm not just here to drop some data or even talk to you about your relational disposition. But I really want to empower you because, as my mom says, information without application is powerless. So I want to make sure that you can walk away from this podcast with tangible tools on how to properly steward your relationship. But to do that, we have to start with a foundation, and that is going to be your identity. Which, side note, I have an entire podcast about the sociology of identity and how it's formed and how it functions in society. So if you want to kind of nerd out a little bit, that's going to be season 2, episode 2 of the show. And I heard the podcast host is kind of cute. Anyways, that's just what I heard. But anywho to huddle, in the context of social science, identity is the set of qualities, beliefs, personality traits, and appearances that characterize a person or a group. Now, your identity is going to be the point of engagement that you have with the world. And it's less about inventing who you are and more about discovering who you are. So let's talk about that. I would say that when it comes to identifying your identity, which is such a fun phrase to say, it's going to actually have to start with your limitations. Like, where are the areas that you fall short? Where are the places that you desire the greatest change? And what is a heartstring that can be easily pulled and either move you to compassion or frustration? Because I feel like those questions often reflect our deepest values and, quite honestly, make us feel the most alive. Now, after you identify what matters most to you, you have to become honest with yourself and your patterns. How do you honor those values with your actions? Because in complete transparency, you can say you value something and in the same breath, not actively do so. You may, for example, say that you value marriage, but your dating pattern, that doesn't really reflect that. You can say that you value forgiveness, that you still have resentment towards that one individual. Because let me tell you, there will always be that one individual in your life. Or you can say that you are appreciative of your work, but honestly wrestle with anxiety and the Sunday scaries. Okay? Now, after you have identified your values and you evaluate the discrepancy between those values and your reality, this is where the identity formation process gets so freaking creative. Because as you begin to operate from a value-based place and you bring in that alignment, you start to show up differently in the world. Here's a cheeky example. When I moved out of my mother's house into my own apartment, it radically shifted who I was as a person. Because as I began to live on my own, and I'm not talking about in a college dorm or with roommates, but living on my own, I began to ask the question of, oh my gosh, Jessamine, who are you? Not only what family traditions do you want to have, like what little routines do you want to develop, like who are you as an individual, but the question was, how do you want to relate to your family? So there was a point where I began to address the quality relationships that I had with my parents, my siblings, my extended family members. And I'm talking about going directly to a person and saying, hey, I want to work on our level of trust. Or, hey, I'm no longer going to have conversations like that because that compromises this boundary for me. Or, hey, like, I know you're trying to push that on me right now as you think that's my responsibility, but it just is a glorified obligation. Like, really knowing how to steward my family relationships because now I have a private standard that I have for myself. And while those conversations can be absolutely unsettling and in complete transparency, they still can be, I've learned that it's better to sit in the tension if it's aligned in truth. And over time, I've observed how it can bring clarity and improve our quality relationship and develop a forward trajectory for who we can become together. So again, that's why identity is so important because once you know who you are, you know how to show up different in the world and that will radically shift you and your relationships. Now, after your identity influences your behavior, your next step will be to identify spaces where it can be cultivated. Because it's not enough just to know who you are in private unless you are willing to express that in public spaces. And what I mean by that statement is this, is community is the incubator to your identity. It's the act of being known, challenged, encouraged, and reflected back to ourselves by other people that we avoid becoming isolated, prideful, or quite honestly, narcissistic with our own self-image. And again, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna throw a little curveball in there. It's not always chosen by you, nor is it convenient. Like when we talk about community, I think people often picture a carefully curated circle of friends who share their same interests and values, and that's cool. However, there are some communities that you don't get a choice in choosing. Whether it's the team you work on, the church that you attend, perhaps the streetcar that you chose, or the person who you sit next to on a flight. And it's in those unchosen relationships that you actually have the greater chance of being who you are. I can't tell you how many times that I've been grateful for my community by setting the standard for social relationships. Whether it's people teaching me how to be more kind to myself, to dream bigger, to learn how to take risks, or to even be more vulnerable. So again, I would say that community operates as a fuel to your identity and also as guardrails, because you have to know what you desire to understand what you deserve, and your community is always going to reflect that. So again, to wrap up this section on identity, once you identify your core values and you find a community to help cultivate that, this is where you can actually start to steward relationships in a healthy way. We're nearing the end of the episode, and I could not be more excited for this section because we finally get to become more practical. Because at this point, we have identified our values, we have developed greater awareness of our relational patterns, and we understand the role identity plays in our social lives. Now, the next question becomes, how do we actively steward relationships well? Because one of the biggest misconceptions about healthy relationships is that the more connections you have equates to better quality of life. And honey, sociology, psychology, and frankly, life experiences suggest otherwise. Because healthy relationships require discernment, and that being the ability to observe character over time and make wise decisions about who we allow into our lives. Instead, I grew up in an environment that encouraged giving everyone access, just in a more subtle way, whether it was be readily available as a student leader, or be friendly to everyone, or be vulnerable, or be generous. Like, while those values and aspirations are beautiful, I was not taught how to sustainably steward myself within those relationships. And as a result, I became naive either to other people's intentions, and I also just struggled to guard my heart. Now, over the years, I found myself wrestling with loneliness in social settings. And as a friendly reminder, loneliness isn't simply being socially isolated. Loneliness occurs when your social needs are not being met. And some of the most socially connected people in the world are often the most misunderstood because it takes time, it takes intentionality to intimately be known by someone else. And it wasn't until I began working in a public-facing job where I experienced hundreds of brief social interactions in a day that I realized, honey, I had to become an advocate for myself. Otherwise, I would end the day emotionally exhausted or move through conversations feeling completely disconnected. And crazy enough, my lack of boundaries that I brought into that job created the perfect environment for me to tighten up. And over the course of the past 2 years, 3 years, I've learned how to navigate conversations more intentionally. I've learned the balance between sharing enough and oversharing. I've learned how to go deep into discussion and then when to bring it back. And I've also become comfortable with relationships naturally coming and going. Like, I've even learned how to crack a joke. And even if it lands short, I mean, tough crowd. Like, I just don't take things as personal anymore. I'm not going to hold you. This process can be a little ghetto. Like, it can be strenuous. It can be long. And you're going to have to embrace the monotonous moments in life. However, I will say, the trick is just the art of showing up. And as you begin to show up every day, unapologetically yourself, whether it lands well or it doesn't land well, you will slowly become more balanced. And now, for myself, I experience little to no anxiety in conversations. I love to say no. And I move through each and every day with confidence that is now rooted in my character rather than another person's approval or any external circumstances. So again, with that being said, here are some tips and tricks. We're going to knock this out on how to steward your relationships well. Number 1, date around when it comes to your friendships. Like, take your time getting to know somebody. See them in a social environment Ask if they want to join like your rugby team. Like literally get to know a person in different seasons and listen to how other people speak of them. And that can give you the confidence of whether to pursue a relationship with this person. And I'm not just talking romantic, I'm also just talking about pure friendship. Number 2, check your emotional state. The hardest relationships I have found to recover from are the ones that I formed when I was not emotionally mature. And when I was going to this person because they satisfied an emotional need or XYZ. So again, know your intentions of why you're pursuing a relationship. And yeah, that applies both romantically and platonically. Number 3, pay attention to what your relationships are producing. There is a biblical proverb that states, walk with the wise, be wise, walk with fools and receive harm. Now again, your relationships are a reflection of your values and they're going to determine your overall health during this lifetime. So a few questions to ask if you need to actively reassess your relationships. You either regularly overextend yourself with reciprocity or clarity. Number 2, you consistently feel drained after interactions. Number 3, you ignore discomfort or misalignment to keep the peace. Number 4, you struggle to distinguish generosity from self-sacrifice. And number 5, you feel responsible for maintaining the entire relationship. Now, after you assess the relationship with those questions, it's important that you don't develop the them versus me mentality because that's 1, unhealthy, and 2, unproductive for society. But allow it to be an opportunity for you to return to your core values and then be a point of re-engagement for your relationships. Now, my third point is this. It's sometimes when you're in a relationship, you can get some relational residue, meaning that when you hang out with a person, you start to talk like them and walk like them. But if you start to feel that a relationship is in conflict with who you are, it's not going the way you want it to go, then it's less about the other person, it's more about you. So if you value kindness, return to being kind. If you value integrity, return to being integrous. If you value healthy communication, return to communicating clearly. So as you begin to reinstate your core values, that's going to shift the status of the relationship, whether you guys continue to be friends or now you're just somebody that you used to know. The next point is steward access wisely. One of the healthiest ways to find balance within yourself and with others is to adjust what you share with people. Because again, information is access, vulnerability is access, time is access, emotional energy is access. And if we return to the social exchange theory and understand that our social relationships mimic that of economic transactions, ask what you're investing in by the information that you share with others and if it is a wise investment, meaning does this person steward my truth well? Do they have the character to provide healthy feedback? And do we have shared values? Next point, you don't have to accept any and every friendship that comes your way. Like when I think of the term friend, that means that this person may take responsibility for my cultivation and vice versa. Like to be a true friend, that requires work. And so you can be friendly, but not everyone has to be your friend. The next point is this. You can build social capital from a sustainable place. For example, you don't need to make everyone your best friend. Like some of the most valuable relationships that I've built through consistency, goodwill, mutual respect often come through my weak ties, whether it's my neighbor, a coworker, a barista, a banista, a classmate, an acquaintance. Like you can understand how much social capacity you have to offer people in a day and still build social capital without compromising your well-being. So hopefully that makes sense. That wasn't too repetitive. But anyways, here is the last point, or else this podcast will never end. Learn to take risks in relationships again. Because there have been plenty of times where I was taken advantage of, whether for emotional support, professional gain, social capital, or simply the companionship of a person needing attention. And the hardest part is when the truth doesn't hit you until afterwards. And it's moments where you walk away from a relationship where you're like, dang, like that was not well balanced, where you want to either shut down or shut other people out. And I didn't realize for a period of time, there are parts of my heart that I had gently tucked away because of the harm that occurred in those areas. However, there was one conversation that opened up my heart again. My dear friend Levi once said, "You can't steal something from me that I freely gave." And when he said that, something internally clicked. And I realized that I could remain generous without having to become skeptical or cynical or emotionally unavailable. And I could continue to be my unapologetic self by adopting discernment. And that gave me the confidence to take risks in relationships, to be kind, put myself out there, and to ultimately be generous, which means to give without expecting anything in return. However, when you find a relationship that reflects the same level of reciprocity in character and in shared values, those are the relationships worth nurturing. Now, with that being said, let's wrap up this podcast with a cheeky conclusion. The social exchange theory suggests that every social interaction can be viewed as a transaction. George St. Homans argues that people often evaluate relationships through a cross-benefit lens, weighing whether a relationship is worth investing in. But rather than using that lens to judge our neighbors, I'd encourage us to use it as a tool for self-reflection. How does my engagement with this person reinforce the values that I want to live by? How does our connection create a sense of reciprocity, trust, and alignment that allows a healthy relationship to grow? And in my experience, I've learned the most sustainable way to build relationships is often through generosity. As you unapologetically live out your values through your words and actions, pay attention to how you're received by the people around you. Those who will consistently value, respect, and reciprocate your efforts are often relationships worth investing in. And others, well, they can just do their own thing, aka they can be repositioned. Because the research is clear. Our character is the constant in all of our relationships. And if we want to change the quality of our relationships, we must first commit to developing the qualities we hope to find in others. And that's not always easy. Because again, it takes time to become an integrous person. It takes time to learn how to say no in a friendship. And it takes time to ask for clarity and communicate your needs and establish healthy boundaries. But there's no better time than to start now. So thank you for tuning in to Season 3, Episode 1, A Specimen the Sociologist. This has been your host, Jasmine Reichman. And yeah, make sure to share this episode with a family, friend, neighbor, coworker. It's streaming on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube. I also have an Instagram page. So yeah, just have some fun. And until next time, have a powerful